The ultimatum was clear. Humanity's silence was worse. The Veth Dominion had delivered ultimatums to 47 civilizations across 6 star systems. 47, and not once, in the entire 600-year history of the Dominion's expansion, had any of those civilizations done anything other than exactly what was expected. Some begged, some bargained, some wept in frequencies we could actually measure. One species, the Orani of the Dust Belt, had fainted. Collectively, their entire diplomatic delegation, all 9 of them just, dropped, unconscious, on the floor. Before we even finished reading the demands aloud, that was our favorite story at diplomatic parties. But none of them, not one, had ever responded with silence. The humans did. Let me back up, because you need to understand what the Veth Dominion actually is before you appreciate just how catastrophically, magnificently, stupidly brave that silence was. The Dominion is not an empire in the way younger species imagine empires. We are not a collection of conquered planets held together by fear and patrol fleets. We are something far more suffocating than that. We are a consensus, a vast, ancient, thoroughly bureaucratic consensus of 61 member species who long ago decided that the most efficient way to manage galactic civilization was to absorb every new spacefaring species the moment they crossed into interstellar territory, assign them a productivity index, and slot them into the machine. The machine runs beautifully, by the way, mostly. The ultimatum itself was standard. Borvak Thessian, our senior envoy, a Veth of considerable status and even more considerable ego, had delivered it personally. Borvak was the kind of diplomat who wore his species' bioluminescent markings like medals, who spoke in measured, resonant tones that had been specifically calibrated over decades to induce compliance. He had a 100% acceptance rate. He kept a plaque about it in his office. He polished the plaque. The terms were clear. Humanity would cease all independent expansion beyond their home system. Humanity would submit their technological catalogs for review and licensing. Humanity would accept 3 Dominion administrative liaisons aboard their primary orbital station, and humanity would, within 48 standard hours, transmit a formal acknowledgement of these terms to Dominion Frequency 77 Alpha. Borvak delivered the message, gave the humans his most professionally intimidating stare, and departed. Then we waited. The 48 hours passed. Dominion monitoring posts flagged the silence at hour 30. By hour 40, Borvak was pacing. By hour 47, he had called an emergency consultation with the expansion committee. I was there. I was the junior analyst assigned to the Sol System file, which until approximately 6 months prior had been the most boring assignment in the entire diplomatic corps. Humanity had only been spacefaring for a little over a century. They had one colony barely established on a cold red planet. Their ships were slow, their communications were quaint, and their entire civilization was technically still arguing with itself about whether the stars were worth the expense. We had not expected them to be interesting. I remember sitting in that consultation room, watching Borvak stare at the silent frequency display, and thinking that perhaps the humans had simply not understood the message. Translation errors happened. We had once accidentally told the Parathi that their sun would explode in 40 days when we meant to say that their trade licenses would expire. That had been a very stressful week. They understood it, said Mireva Sultan, the xenolinguistics lead, without looking up from her console. Mireva was small for her species, a Quellan, with 4 eyes that could independently track separate data streams and a personality like very cold water. She did not speculate, she stated. 17 confirmed receptions across their primary communication grid. The message was retransmitted by their own news networks within 4 hours. They discussed it publicly. Borvak turned slowly. They discussed it extensively and then said nothing to us. Correct. There was a long silence in the room. A deeply uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that made even the ventilation system feel like it was holding its breath. They are afraid, said Councillor Dovrek Onash, the senior Veth present, a diplomat so old his secondary pigmentation had faded to almost white. Duvrek had been doing this for longer than some member species had been spacefaring. He said it the way you say a thing you want to believe but are not entirely sure of. Mireva's 4 eyes all moved toward him at once. Their public transmissions do not read as fear. What do they read as? She paused, which for Mireva was practically a theatrical gesture. Consideration. We all sat with that word for a moment. Consideration, Borvac repeated. They appear to be, she scrolled through something on her screen, discussing the terms, analyzing them, arguing with each other about the implications. There is significant internal disagreement about whether to comply, about whether the terms are reasonable. That was the moment the room got very quiet in a different way. Not the uncomfortable silence of confusion, but the sharp, attentive silence of people who have just heard something that does not fit any category they have prepared for. Because here is the thing about the Dominion's ultimatum process. It is not a negotiation. It has never been a negotiation. The terms are not presented as a starting position. They are presented as a conclusion. The only expected responses are acceptance or, in the rare cases of civilizations too primitive to understand their situation, continued silence followed by a physical demonstration of Dominion capabilities, which usually resolved things fairly quickly. No one had ever questioned whether the terms were reasonable. That was not a category that existed in our process. They think, Duvrek said slowly, that we are opening a conversation. Mireva tilted her head. Or they think we are, and are deliberately operating as if that is the case. Borvac sat down heavily. I watched his bioluminescent markings dim slightly, which for his species was the equivalent of a very long exhale. Send a follow-up transmission. Remind them of the deadline. Make it clear that non-response constitutes rejection, and rejection carries consequences. The follow-up was sent. The humans acknowledged it within 6 minutes. A crisp, technically perfect acknowledgement of receipt, with a formal notation that their Interstellar Affairs Council was convened and deliberating, and that they anticipated providing a substantive response within 72 hours of the original deadline. Not 48, 72. They had just, without any particular drama, extended their own deadline. I looked at that message for a long time. There was something in it that I found deeply unsettling and could not immediately name. It was not aggressive. It was not pleading. It was the tone of it, I think. It read like correspondence between equals, not like a species addressing a galactic superpower that had just outlined the terms of their absorption. Like a planetary council writing back to a trade partner to say, kindly hold on, we are still reviewing the contract. Duvrek read it 3 times. Prepare a fleet response, he said quietly. Now, fleet responses in the Dominion's diplomatic toolkit are not subtle. A fleet response is not a threat delivered in language. It is a threat delivered in metal, in engine signatures, in the very particular quality of light that 47 warships make when they drop out of transit within sensor range of your home system. It is a demonstration of capacity. Look at what we are. Look at how many of us there are. Look at how small you are in comparison. It had never failed to produce an immediate and thorough reconsideration. 31 warships were dispatched. Borvac personally led the convoy. I was transferred to his staff for the duration, which I understood to be an honor, but which felt, as we crossed into Sol system space, increasingly like something else. Something I did not have a precise word for. An apprehension, maybe. A sense that I was watching a very confident person walk toward a door that was not quite the shape they expected. The fleet dropped out of transit at the outer edge of the system, precisely positioned for maximum visual impact against the backdrop of deep space. Vorvac opened a hailing frequency immediately. The humans responded in 4 seconds. Not a panicked scramble. Not a delay suggesting sudden desperate activity aboard their stations. 4 seconds. Clean, clear, and calm. The voice that came through was a woman's. Her name, we learned shortly after, was Director Yulina Fasari, head of Earth's newly formed Interstellar Affairs Council, a title that had been created approximately 6 days earlier specifically because of us. She had a voice like someone who had been told very bad news many times and had developed a particular relationship with it. Not numb, just steady. Dominion Fleet, this is Director Fasari of the Earth Interstellar Affairs Council. We have your fleet on full sensor coverage. We want you to know that we are not alarmed. Borvac blinked. His markings did a complicated thing. Director Fasari, the Veth Dominion has authorized me to. We received your follow-up transmission, she continued, at a pace that was not quite interrupting but was very close to it. We are still deliberating. We appreciate your patience. There was a quality to that last sentence. A quality that I think even Borvac felt, though he would never have admitted it. She was not thanking him for patience he had offered. She was thanking him for patience he had not offered, and thereby informing him that as far as she was concerned, he had agreed to provide it. The fleet sat at the edge of the system. The humans went back to deliberating. I spent the next 18 hours reviewing every piece of available data on human civilization, history, and psychology that our xenological archives contained. I do not know exactly what I was looking for. Some explanation, maybe, some cultural framework that would make their behavior legible. What I found instead was a history that read like a species that had been conducting its own internal ultimatum exchange for approximately 10,000 years and had developed, out of pure necessity, a very sophisticated relationship with the question of what to do when a more powerful party tells you that you have no choice. The answer, historically, was complicated. Sometimes they complied, sometimes they fought. Sometimes they did something that fell into neither category and turned out to be far more consequential than either. I flagged that last pattern for Borvac's attention. He did not read my report before the human's response arrived. The response came at hour 71, not hour 72, hour 71, 1 hour early, which I noted in my log with the kind of specific attention you give to details that feel like they mean something, but you cannot yet prove it. The humans had taken exactly as long as they wanted, not a minute more. Not a minute more than that, carefully, deliberately stated 72 hours, and precisely 1 minute less, as if to make absolutely clear that the timeline had always been theirs. Director Fasari's voice came through again. Same steadiness, same unhurried cadence. Dominion Fleet, we are prepared to transmit our formal response to the Veth Dominion's terms. Please confirm receipt on your primary diplomatic frequency. Borvac confirmed. I watched his markings cycle through 3 different colors in about 2 seconds, which was the bioluminescent equivalent of a very complicated internal experience. The transmission arrived. It was long, considerably longer than any acceptance document in Dominion diplomatic history, and considerably more structured than any rejection. It was neither of those things. What it was a counter-proposal. 47 pages, annotated, with footnotes. Footnotes. I will give you a moment with that. The humans had received a galactic superpower's ultimatum, watched a fleet of 31 warships park itself at the edge of their star system, and responded with a 47-page annotated counter-proposal with footnotes citing, among other things, 3 separate principles of interstellar law that the Dominion itself had ratified approximately 200 years prior, and then largely forgotten about. Borvac read the first page, then the second. Then he set the document down and looked at nothing in particular for a while. I had read ahead, I kept reading. The human document was, technically, brilliant. Not in an aggressive way. Not in the way of a civilization trying to start a fight. It was brilliant in the way of a civilization that had spent 71 hours in a room full of lawyers, historians, engineers, and diplomats who had all been told the same thing. We cannot match their power, so we need to match their process. They had combed through every piece of Dominion legal framework available in public interstellar archives. They had found the inconsistencies. They had found the precedents, and they had constructed, with meticulous, almost affectionate precision, an argument that the Dominion's terms as presented were not actually consistent with the Dominion's own foundational charter. Article 19, Section 4, Clause B. Member and candidate species retain provisional sovereignty over internally developed technologies for a period of no less than 3 standard decades following first contact. contingent on non-hostile engagement. The humans had found Article 19, Section 4, Clause B. We had genuinely forgotten about Article 19, Section 4, Clause B. It had been written during a very different era of Dominion expansion, when there had been legitimate debate about the pace of absorption, and it had been quietly buried under approximately a century and a half of procedural sediment. No species had ever invoked it. No species had ever known to look for it. The humans had found it in 71 hours using public archives, and what I could only assume was a truly extraordinary quantity of whatever stimulant beverage they favored. I found out later it was coffee. I have since developed a deep respect for coffee. Councillor Duvrek was brought into the communication loop. Then the full expansion committee. Then, in a development that Borvac would spend the next several years trying to forget, the Dominion's own legal division was asked to review the human document. The legal division took 9 hours. Their conclusion was that the humans were technically correct. Not about everything. The counter-proposal had overreaches, points where the humans had pushed their interpretation further than the text strictly supported, places where the footnotes were doing more structural work than they could comfortably bear. But the core argument held. The technology licensing demand as written violated Article 19. The administrative liaisons provision was legally ambiguous at best. The expansion restriction could potentially stand, but only if it was formally reclassified as a candidate species protocol, which triggered an entirely different set of procedural requirements, including, and this was the part that made Borvac's markings go completely dark for about 30 seconds, a mandatory consultation period of no less than 1 standard year, 1 year, during which the humans could continue doing exactly what they were already doing. They knew, Mariva said, during the emergency staff meeting that followed the legal division's report. She was not surprised. She had stopped being surprised approximately 48 hours into this entire situation, and I suspected she had filed some internal adjustment in her assessment of humanity that the rest of us were only now catching up to. They knew we would not remember Article 19. They counted on it. The entire counter-proposal is structured around the assumption that we have been operating on procedural autopilot for long enough that our own foundations would surprise us. That is, Duvrek said carefully, an extraordinarily sophisticated read of Dominion institutional behavior for a species that has been aware of us for less than a year. They have extensive historical literature on institutional decay, Mariva replied, pulling up a reference. Considerably more than most species their age. Apparently, it is something they have personal experience with. The consultation period began. I want to be precise about what happened during that year, because it tends to get simplified in the retellings. People like to say the humans outmaneuvered the Dominion legally, and that was that. That is not quite right. The legal victory bought them time. What they did with the time was the actual story. Director Fasari requested direct liaison access to the expansion committee, which was technically within candidate species rights under the consultation protocol, and which no candidate species had ever actually requested, because no candidate species had ever read far enough into the protocol to know it was an option. The committee agreed, largely because refusing would have required invoking an exception clause that would have taken longer to process than simply allowing it. She brought 2 people with her to the first meeting. A man named Petros Anagnios, who was their lead interstellar legal scholar, and who had the specific quality of someone who genuinely enjoyed reading very long documents, and a woman named Chiamaka Osei, their chief xenoeconomics analyst, who had prepared a presentation on Dominion internal trade inefficiencies that was so precise and so gently devastating that 2 members of the committee requested copies of it for their own reference. The meetings were supposed to be procedural, status checks, formalities. They became, over the course of several months, something considerably more interesting. Fasari did not argue. That was the thing that kept catching me off guard, and I was attending every session as the junior analyst on record. She did not push. She did not advocate in the conventional sense. She asked questions, very specific, very informed questions, the kind that assumed deep familiarity with Dominion internal structures, and that forced the people being questioned to either answer carefully or reveal that they did not know their own systems as well as they thought. She was pleasant throughout, warm even. The committee members, several of whom had been deeply irritated by humanity's initial legal maneuver, found themselves, over time, somewhat reluctantly engaged. Petros found 3 more buried clauses over the course of the consultation year. He sent each one to the Dominion Legal Division with a brief note that read, in each case, something to the effect of, "We thought you might want to be aware of this," entirely without further comment, which was its own kind of comment. Chiamaka's economic analysis, distributed initially just within the committee, made its way through informal channels to approximately a dozen member species economic ministries. 2 of them independently requested follow-up consultations with the human delegation, and all the while, quietly, the humans kept building. Not weapons. That was the thing our defense analysts had been watching for and kept not finding. They expanded the colony on the cold red planet. They launched 3 new deep space observation platforms. They developed and tested a transit drive prototype that our engineering division, reviewing the publicly filed technical specifications, rated as remarkably efficient for its development stage. Everything was filed properly, transparently, through the consultation protocols. Every document stamped and submitted and above reproach. They were building the skeleton of an interstellar civilization, piece by piece, in plain sight, while simultaneously sitting in conference rooms, asking the Dominion's own committee members very polite questions about why certain efficient practices in Sector 9 had been discontinued 40 years ago. By month 10, Duvrek had stopped referring to the human situation as a compliance problem. I noticed it, wrote it down, flagged it in my log. By month 11, 3 member species had formally requested that human representatives be invited to address the Dominion's General Economic Forum. In month 12, Director Fasari submitted the human delegation's formal response to the 1-year consultation. It was not a counter-proposal this time. It was a membership application, not candidate species status. Full membership. With a co-authored legal framework amendment drafted in collaboration with 2 existing member species legal teams that would reform the absorption protocol from the ground up. The document cited, among other things, every buried clause Petros had found, every precedent Chiamaka had traced, and included a technical appendix on Dominion economic inefficiencies with specific proposed solutions that the appendix noted, with characteristic human restraint, were offered in the spirit of mutual benefit. The footnotes alone were 40 pages. Borvac, when presented with the document, looked at it for a long time. His markings stayed completely still, which was unusual for him. Still and a steady, deep blue, which in Veth physiology indicated something between profound recalibration and something he would later, in his retirement memoir, describe as the specific sensation of a very long-held assumption quietly leaving the body. They were never afraid, he said, not to anyone in particular. No, I agreed. From the beginning. The silence. The deadline extension. The legal framework. All of it. Yes, they were building a record, he said. Every exchange. Every document. Every meeting. They were building a record of how the Dominion treats a new species, and making sure that record was visible to every member species watching. I had reached that conclusion approximately 9 months earlier, but it did not seem like the right moment to mention it. The membership application was reviewed by the full Dominion Assembly. It took 4 months, which was actually faster than standard process, largely because the co-authoring member species advocated aggressively for expedited review. The legal reform amendment attached to it generated the most sustained internal debate the Assembly had seen in 60 years. The amendment passed. Narrowly, and with modifications, but it passed. Humanity was admitted to the Veth Dominion as a full member species, not a candidate. Not an absorbed civilization with a productivity index and a slot in the machine. A member with a seat on the expansion committee, a permanent legal observer role, and a quietly historic footnote in the Dominion Charter that several legal scholars later described as the most significant structural reform in 2 centuries. Chiamaka Osei went on to co-chair the Dominion's first-ever Internal Economic Efficiency Commission. Petros Anagnos was eventually appointed to the Legal Review Board that I genuinely believe he had been angling toward since month 2. Director Fasari served 2 terms on the Expansion Committee before returning to Earth to, as she put it in her final committee address, attend to other matters, delivered with an expression that suggested the other matters were equally strategic and considerably more fun. Borvac retired. He took the plaque with him. I heard he put it in storage. I kept working the Sol system file. I keep it to this day, though it requires considerably more staff than it used to. It is, without any competition, the most interesting file in the diplomatic corps. The humans have since invoked Article 19 on behalf of 4 other candidate species, filed 11 separate legal challenges to absorption protocols, and introduced a motion to rename the foundational consultation framework after a principle from their own legal history. The motion passed. We call it the Fasari Doctrine now. I think about that original silence sometimes. 48 hours of nothing, while 31 warships sat at the edge of their star system, and the most decorated diplomat in the Dominion polished his 100% acceptance plaque. I think about what it must have looked like from the inside of that deliberation. The weight of it. The very clear understanding that the entity on the other end of the frequency had absorbed 47 civilizations and had never once been told no, and yet they were not measuring the size of what they were facing. They were reading its paperwork. That is the thing about humanity that I find, after all this time, still genuinely difficult to file under any existing category. They are not reckless. They are not fearless in the way of creatures that do not understand danger. They understand danger extremely well. They have a long and extensively documented history of understanding danger, and then, with great deliberateness, deciding that the paperwork matters more. The Orani, by the way, heard about the Fasari Doctrine. Their diplomatic delegation sent a formal note to the human mission. All 9 of them signed it.